Frost silvered the fence wire before sunup. A man knelt in the mud with a fence stretcher clenched between his knees, breath rising in ragged clouds. 25 shapes moved behind him in the gray light, huge, shaggy, patient as boulders. One lifted its head and blew a long plume of steam into the cold. The man didn't look up. He drove another cedar post into the frozen ground, 3 strikes, 4, the mallet ringing out over empty pasture. Somewhere a rooster called and went unanswered. His hands were cracked at the knuckles. His coat was borrowed. Behind him, on a hill he no longer owned outright, a surveyor's orange flag snapped in the wind. A pickup slowed on the county road, gravel popping under its tires. The driver leaned out, squinting at the animals grazing where cattle should have been. He didn't wave. He didn't call out. He just shook his head slow, the way a man does at something he's already decided isn't his business, and rolled on toward town, dust hanging behind him like a held breath. The man at the fence line straightened, watched the truck go, and turned back to his work. He had 11 days left, and 25 animals nobody in that county believed would save a single blessed thing. Before we get into how a man staked his whole future on a herd of bison instead of a $250,000 check, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss where this one goes. And down in the comments, let me know what part of the country you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. The land sat outside Bitter Creek, Carbon County, Wyoming, where the wind came down off the snowy range with nothing to slow it, and the grass grew short and tough as wire. Bitter Creek wasn't much of a town, a feed store, a diner with 4 booths, a church with a bell that hadn't rung true since a hailstorm cracked it in '09. Everybody there knew everybody's business, and by the spring this story starts, everybody knew the Ostranders were drowning. Elam Ostrander had run cattle on that land the way his father and grandfather had, until 3 dry summers in a row burned the pasture down to dust and the herd down to nothing worth selling. The vet bills came before the rain did. Then came the back taxes, quietly stacking up like snow against a door nobody opened. His wife, Thessaly, kept the numbers in a spiral notebook she never let out of the kitchen drawer, and some nights Elam found her sitting with it closed in front of her, just staring, like opening it again might make the debt heavier. Their boy, Ansel, was 15 and old enough to understand what the men in trucks meant when they came around with clipboards. He remembers his mother pouring coffee for a man from Highline Development who never once looked at the mountains while he talked, only at the flat stretch of grass behind the barn, measuring it with his eyes like a butcher measuring a hog. The offer was $250,000 for the west parcel, enough to clear every debt the family owed and then some, enough to make the trouble simply disappear. Elam turned it down at the kitchen table on a Tuesday night, and Thessaly didn't argue, though her silence lasted 3 days. What he told the developer's man was short. The land wasn't for sale. What he didn't tell him, what he barely let himself think, was the plan already taking root in the back 40, where the fence posts were going in and a stock trailer had backed up a ramp 2 weeks before, unloading animals nobody in 3 counties had ever kept on purpose. At the feed store, Odell Brandt heard about it first, the way Odell heard about everything. He was loading sacks of oats into his truck bed when he said it loud enough for the whole lot to hear, that Elam Ostrander had turned down $250,000 to go raise buffalo like some fella out of a picture show. Men laughed. One asked if Elam planned to hunt them with a bow next. Odell just shook his head and said some men would rather go down proud than go down sensible, and nobody in that parking lot disagreed with him. What none of them saw was what happened at first light, before the ridicule started its rounds through town. Elam walked his fence line every morning with a notebook of his own, marking where the herd had grazed, where they hadn't, where their hooves had churned the dry ground into something that looked, to an untrained eye, like ruin. He wasn't running bison for meat, not yet, not mainly. He was running them to heal ground that 3 years of drought and a century of hard grazing had beaten half to death, and he'd read enough, and asked enough old-timers and one patient extension biologist over the phone to believe it could work. proof was slow, and it was ugly before it was anything else. Where the herd wallowed, rolling in the dust to shed their heavy coats, they carved shallow bowls in the earth, bowls that looked like scars. Elam had learned those bowls held rain, held snowmelt, kept water on the land instead of letting it run straight off into the creek and out of the county entirely. He'd learned their grazing pattern, chaotic and restless compared to cattle, tore up old sod, and let native grass seed find bare dirt to root in. It was a slow, strange, invisible kind of building, and it looked to everyone driving past like a man had simply lost his mind, and his cattle money along with it. "You know what that ground's gonna look like come August," Odell told him one Sunday outside church, not unkindly, just certain. "Chewed to nothing. Buffalo don't graze like cattle, Elam. They don't graze like anything with sense." Elam only nodded and said he supposed they'd find out together. Odell clapped him on the shoulder the way a man does when he thinks he's watching a friend walk off a cliff, and there wasn't a soul in that churchyard who thought Odell was wrong. Then came the letter that turned 11 days into 9. A regional outbreak of brucellosis had been confirmed in elk herds 40 miles north, and the state veterinarian's office issued a quarantine order for every bison operation in 3 counties. Herds unable to certify clean by inspection would face mandatory depopulation. The inspector's name was Verlin Cusack, and his letter was polite and absolute. Elam read it twice at the kitchen table, and Thessaly, watching his face, didn't need to ask what it said. The timing could not have been worse. 9 days to prove a fragile, half-built herd was healthy, on land the bank already circled like a hawk, with a development man due back any week now with a fresh offer, likely lower, betting the family would be desperate enough to take it. Ansel offered to skip school and help round the herd for testing. Elam said no, then said yes 2 days later because there weren't enough hands otherwise. The midpoint came on a Thursday, cold and mean. A blizzard rolled down early off the mountains, 3 weeks ahead of anything the almanac predicted, and dumped 18 inches on ground that hadn't finished drying from spring runoff. The hay Elam had budgeted to stretch through inspection week vanished in 4 days, feeding a herd trapped by drifts too deep to graze through. He drove to 3 counties looking for hay he could afford and found none he could afford in time. He stood in the barn that night with the last bales stacked around him like the walls of something closing in, and for the first time since he'd unloaded that trailer, he let himself think the word Odell had been too polite to say out loud, fool. Thessaly found him there past midnight, sitting on an overturned bucket, not working, just sitting, and she didn't say a word of comfort. She handed him her notebook, opened to a fresh page, and said they'd figure the numbers together, same as always. By morning, Elam had sold the last of his father's tools he'd sworn he'd never part with: a hand plow, a set of antique branding irons, to a collector 2 towns over, enough cash for 4 days of emergency hay hauled in from Nebraska. It wasn't a solution. It was a patch, ugly and expensive, holding a dam that still had 5 days of pressure left to survive. He drove home in the dark with the truck bed loaded, past Odell's place, where the porch light was still on, like Odell had been watching the road. Verlin Cusack came out on day 7, boots crunching new snow, clipboard under his arm, his breath visible as he moved animal to animal with the calm thoroughness of a man who'd seen 100 operations fail and didn't expect this one to be different. Elam walked the fence line beside him in silence, watching the inspector's pen move across the page, watching for any flicker of the verdict before the words came. Verlin didn't say much. He never did until the last shoot. "Herd's clean," Verlin finally said, snapping his clipboard shut. "Better condition than I expected given the winter you just had." He looked out over the pasture, over the strange shallow bowls pocking the snow-covered ground, and said nothing more about it, though his eyes lingered there a moment longer than they needed to. 2 days of quarantine deadline left, and clean was the one word Elam had been praying to hear. It wasn't victory yet. It was only survival. The real proof was still coming, though nobody standing in that snow that morning knew it yet. The storm arrived 4 days later, the kind old-timers in Bitter Creek would talk about for a decade, 3 inches of rain in 6 hours onto ground still half frozen underneath. The creek jumping its banks before noon, culverts backing up along the county road until they gave way entirely. Odell's neighbor to the south, who'd taken Highline's offer the year before and let the company scrape his west field bare for a future subdivision, watched brown water come off that graded slope in a wall, carrying topsoil, fence posts, and half a shed down into the county road below. Odell drove out that afternoon to check on his own low pasture, half expecting the worst, and instead found himself stopped dead at the top of the rise above Elam's land. The water there hadn't rushed. It had pooled, caught in shallow bowl after shallow bowl scattered across the pasture, sitting calm and brown and contained, soaking slowly into ground stitched thick with native grass roots the bison's restless grazing had coaxed back to life. The herd stood grazing above the flood line, unbothered, steam rising off their backs into the drizzle, as if the whole county hadn't just come apart around them. By the next morning, half of Bitter Creek had driven the county road to see it for themselves, the Ostrander pasture standing green and whole, while 3 neighboring properties counted washed-out culverts, buried fence lines, and 1 collapsed equipment shed. The extension biologist Elam had once called on the phone showed up in person this time, walking the wallows with a notebook of her own, photographing the water sitting exactly where it was supposed to sit. Verlin Cusack came back too, unofficially just to look, and stood a long while at the fence saying nothing at all. Odell found Elam at the barn that evening, hay dust still hanging gold in the last of the light. He didn't make a speech. He just stood a moment, looking out at the herd grazing calm in the mud, then at the water pooled bright as coins in bowl after bowl across the field, and said the drought years had taught him plenty about cattle and not one thing about ground like this. Then he asked, quiet, whether Elam figured a man his age was too old to learn something new from a herd of buffalo. Word of the flood and what it hadn't done to the Ostrander place traveled the way news does in a small county, through the diner, through the feed store, through phone calls between kitchens, until reporters from 2 counties over came asking questions, and the university extension office asked to run a formal study on the land. Highline Development's man never came back with a second offer. There wasn't a field left flat enough, or a family desperate enough to make one worth his drive. By late summer, Elam Ostrander wasn't the fool of Carbon County anymore. He was fielding calls from ranchers 3 states over asking how a wallow held water and how a man convinced a bank to wait on him. Thessaly's notebook filled with different numbers now, grazing consulting fees, a small state restoration grant, inquiries about breeding stock. Ansel spent his Saturdays out with the herd instead of in it out of duty, learning the animals' habits the way his father had, only without the fear underneath it. Odell still stopped by most Sundays, though the shake of his head had turned into something closer to a nod. He never did apologize outright, that wasn't his way, but he started sending his grandson over to help at branding time, and he stopped calling them buffalo in that voice he used to use, the one that made the word sound like a punchline. Some things a man shows you instead of saying. The pasture still bears those shallow bowls today, dozens of them, catching light and rain the same patient way they always did, long after the flood that made the whole county finally look twice. Elam still walks the fence line most mornings before the sun clears the ridge, notebook in hand, watching a herd that once made him a laughingstock now graze on ground that held when everything around it gave way. Folks in Bitter Creek don't call it foolishness anymore. They call it the Ostrander Bowls, and they say the land remembers what saved it, even when the people almost didn't.